The stars beyond Sector 91 Beta burned quietly, sterile in their emptiness, the way the Jarthreith liked them. Order thrived in silence. Commander Vel stood motionless at the forward viewplate, a long-fingered hand behind his back, watching the dead edge of mapped space slip past. His gaze did not wander. It measured, categorized, judged. There was no mystery here, only incomplete data waiting for closure. Signal confirmed. The ship's AIK-17 intoned in its neutral hum. Source: planetary surface. Classification: Terran-based language. Degraded but functional. Vel blinked once. Terran? That term hadn't been uttered outside of archives in decades. Earth, once a curiosity, had gone dark and irrelevant. Humanity had scattered, diluted, forgotten itself. The last time they'd cataloged a live colony was 50 years ago. A decayed outpost floating in a gravity well filled with corpses and junk transmissions. What's the signal content? Vel asked. The bridge fell silent. A scratch of static filled the speakers, followed by a voice human, unmistakably so gruff and broken, like rocks grinding against metal. Hold the line. If they step into the iron, we bury them in it. K-17 analyzed the waveform. No encryption. Vocal patterns inconsistent with known dialects. Likely cultural evolution, multiple influences. Vel's eyes narrowed. He turned, calm as ever, and gestured. Dispatch the field vessel. Minimum arms. Maximum scanners. I want structured data, biological tags, environmental viability. Nothing else. No hesitation. No consultation with Fleet Command. Just procedure. After all, it was just humans. The Jarthreith research vessel Araskith descended into the planet's lower orbit with graceful precision. Beneath them lay a world draped in ash-colored ridges and jagged valleys. There was no visible flora. No atmospheric movement. No herds, no nests, no sounds. The entire landscape was perfectly, unnaturally quiet. Lieutenant Saren, the biological lead, ran her scans 3 times. Negative on all native fauna. 0 thermal deviations. No atmospheric anomalies. This place is dead. Vel didn't respond. He stared at the terrain. Then at the coordinates pulsing faintly in the upper hemisphere. A settlement existed, but it had no surface structures. The colony was underground. They landed. The outer shell of the colony's entrance was crude steel, coated in soot and age. It looked built to endure firestorms, not welcome visitors. The only door was a heavy bulkhead, wide enough for vehicles. Scorch marks stretched across the wall's old damage, long sealed. There was no greeting, no comes, no warning beacon. Just the echo of silence as the airlock opened into shadow. Vel stepped through with 4 others. Scanners swept the hall. Data came in jumbled magnetic interference, strange alloys, wiring buried under what appeared to be hand-welded plating. The deeper they moved, the stranger it became. Hallways were dense and narrow. Burned symbols lined the walls, scratched into the steel, some in Terran script, others in something entirely new. Then, at the 4th junction, they saw him, a man-if. That term still applied, stood at the end of the corridor. Tall, bare-chested, his skin was like aged stone, lined with deep ritual scars. His eyes glowed faintly, artificial. His left arm ended not in flesh but a welded mechanical limb, jointed and fused into the bone with no aesthetic, no polish. Just function. He didn't move. He didn't raise a weapon. He stared. Vel paused. Human, you are in contact with the diplomatic science vessel of the Jarthreith Collective. Identify. The man didn't reply. He spat. Saren activated the drone scan. The AI began collecting data. Muscle tension, thermal output, facial analysis. Man twitched, K-17, Vel said. Report. Silence. Then the AIS voice returned, low and flat. Subject is not passively scanned. It is emitting false readings. It has memorized our scan patterns. Vel felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear, anticipation. Commander, Saren said, voice cracking. He's watching us like we're the anomaly. Vel took a step back, eyes now locked with the man's unblinking gaze. I think, he said slowly, we've stepped into something far older than it looks. And still, the human said nothing. He only smiled. The research vessel Arasketh returned to orbit, its engines whispering against the vacuum as it broke from the silence below. But the silence followed. It crept into the data logs, corrupted the sensor feeds, and burrowed into the minds of the crew. What they had seen on the surface wasn't a derelict colony. It was a mirror turned towards something that Jarthreith had never prepared for humanity without restraint, without connection, without anything left to lose. Commander Vel stood alone. In the briefing chamber, a single frame frozen on the holoscreen before him, the man from the tunnel. Half machine, eyes like burned coals, scars etched into his body like a language. Vel had dealt with aggression before. He had catalogued hundreds of warfaring species, some reckless, some genius in their brutality. But this was something different. This wasn't a defense response. It was performance. The human had chosen to stand there. To be seen, K-17's voice interrupted his thoughts. Preliminary scans of recovered visual feed indicate intentional deception within the colony's structure. Vel turned. Explain? The corridors are not consistent with natural expansion or survival-driven construction. They are designed to confuse, to trap. They possess overlapping blind zones, no obvious exits, false ventilation shafts. Psychological. Architecture. Built to disorient, Vel muttered. Built to study, the AI corrected. He dismissed the feed and stepped into the command well. Prep a recon run. No bots this time. Live team. Standard sweep. The crew hesitated. Sir? You? Heard me, he barked. We go in. 3 soldiers descended to the surface within the hour LT, Moran and 2 others. This time they were armed. Rail carbines, reflex armor. They entered through the same path the first party had used, but the walls felt different now. Not just cold, aware. Condensation formed where there had been none before. The lights flickered in sync with the hum of unseen generators. They moved slow. Then the air changed. A single word repeated, whispered in broken static through the comms. Resist, resist. Source? Moran demanded. No signal origin? The tech responded. The sound is bouncing through the walls. 10 minutes in, they found the first chamber. A room of bones, some human, some not. Arranged neatly. Categorized. This was no grave. This was a museum. Who the hell would keep these? Whispered one of the soldiers. Then the door slammed behind them. Magnetic locks hissed shut. From the corner of the room, a voicemail, calm. Human echoed into the comms. You brought weapons. Smart. But you brought your fear with you. That's the real mistake. Identify yourself. Moran shouted, swinging his rifle around. No response. Only a clicking sound from a sliding panel at the far end of the room. A figure emerged. Another human, taller, broader. His skin shimmered with embedded tech. His face was marked with streaks of soot and war paint. He walked without fear, without caution. He didn't need a weapon. Moran lifted his rifle. Stop right there. The man just smiled. Then gas hissed from above. Not lethal, psychotropic. The alien suits filtered it for toxins, but not confusion. Moran's HUD began to flicker. The walls seemed to move. His partner screamed, firing at a shadow that wasn't there. The human moved, not with speed, but with absolute clarity. He walked through the hallucinations like they didn't matter. The colonists had designed this room for failure. And it worked. The next thing Moran knew, he was back on the surface, bleeding, half-blind, carried by instinct. The colony had let him go, let him escape. And that terrified him more than death. On the Arasketh, Vel met him at the bay doors. What happened down there? Moran collapsed to his knees. They let us in not to kill us, to watch us. We were a field test. They wanted to measure us. They wanted data. Vel stared in silence. They're not just survivors, Moran whispered. Eyes hollow. They're building something. Training for something. They don't want to come back to Earth. They want to come for it. That night, the Arasketh's command deck remained dark. No celebrations, no debriefs, just silence. Then a tremor rocked the ship. A Ven alarm blared. 2 Jarth officers dead. A child escaped before anyone could trace them. Etched into the walls of the Cums Bay were the words, "Observation ends. Trial begins." Vel watched the feed on loop. The child had smiled as he killed, not with joy, with purpose. This wasn't survival. This was doctrine. This was war. Smoke still lingered in the Arasketh's lower corridors, clinging to the chrome walls like a warning the ship refused to heed. Cleanup drones buzzed silently, wiping away the blood of 2 Jarth officers killed not by soldiers, not by mutants, but by human children barely past adolescence. One stabbed with a blade forged from broken starship steel. The other wielded a homemade pulse disruptor with a precision that suggested not rebellion but ritual. Vel stood at the center of the command bridge, his reflection staring back at him from the darkened view screen. Behind his composed posture, behind the clinical detachment, the edges of something older than fear had begun to form. This was not a tactical loss. This was a crack in the narrative. The Jarthreith did not lose control. They were controlled until now. They're testing us, he said aloud, more to the air than to the crew. And we're failing every measure. K-17 responded from above. Commander, the Jarth Central Authority has denied your request for immediate planetary purge. Protocol demands further study and non-lethal containment. Vel didn't even blink. And what does protocol recommend we do with enemies who've already studied us better than we've studied them? No answer. In the dark hollow below, in a bunker stitched together from starship bones and industrial debris, a man named Garen stood barefoot beneath a steel altar. His body was covered in deep scars, some old, some fresh, each one intentional. Behind him stood 5 other men, each silent, each shaped by the same fires that had turned their pain into steel. They're watching the stars again, Garen said quietly, looking for someone to save them from us. A boy no older than 10 stepped forward. His eyes burned not with hate, but with clarity. In his hands was a broken piece of Jarthra armor, held like a trophy. Have they earned our silence? The boy asked. Garen stared for a long moment. Then he pointed toward the forge. Not yet. Go and make them remember. The colony had no schools, no temples. Its children learned through drills, through pain, through discipline. They studied enemy languages through intercepted transmissions. They memorized the sound of different ships entering atmosphere. They were taught to survive not in case war came, but because it always would. At dawn, Garen's corps met again in the war chamber. A new plan was laid across the rusted holotable, etched not in light, but in jagged pieces of alloy, each one labeled by hand. The colony had built its own map, one that didn't rely on satellite feed, one that moved with the Jarth. We could. Strike again, said Malric, now barely 17, his body already bearing the bulk of a full-grown soldier. Their lower thrusters are damaged. We send a ghost unit cripple the I node. No, Garen replied, voice low. We don't kill them yet. We make them bleed first. He pointed to the chamber's corner, where a boy stood silently in the shadows, his eyes wide, his breath slow and even. In his hands was a kit of wires, glass, and primitive detonators. Garen didn't speak. The boy nodded. He would not kill. Tonight, he would watch. The enemy would bleed into the lesson. Back on the ship, Vel knew something had to change. He summoned Moran. I need infiltration, Vel said. Not bots, not bombs. Someone who knows how to think like them. Moran, still stitched and half-blind in one eye, gave a bitter smile. You want me to volunteer? No, Vel replied. I want you to go because you already understand them. The drop pod descended in silence, masked under a debris field, generated by the ship's decoy protocols. It landed near a cliffside unscanned, unwatched, or so the data said. But down below, children crouched with lenses fashioned from shattered drone optics, calibrated by hand. They had been watching that sky for hours. When the pod landed, they didn't run. They didn't raise alarms. They simply pulsed to signal 3 flashes of infrared, carried on a beam of refracted heat, and vanished. The colony already knew. Moran moved low, his steps precise. The scars on his leg ached, but he pushed forward. He was hunting not for a target, but for truth. The tunnels welcomed him like veins swallowing blood. He moved through a decommissioned generator room and stepped into something stranger, a cathedral of whispers. Dozens of children, no older than 12, stood in rows, eyes closed, chanting not prayers, but data, missile designations, pressure limits, alien anatomy. Not rehearsing, becoming. Then one boy turned his head, eyes met, and a second later, the alarm howled. Moran ran behind him. The shadows grew teeth. Ascendants emerged from the metal like phantoms, bodies fused with alloys, muscles wrapped in carbon. Cables, eyes flickering with implanted tracking lights. They didn't rush, they hunted. Moran's coms failed. His HUD glitched, his weapon locked. Every tool given to him by the Jarthreith failed. And all he could do was run because survival was a lesson he'd only now begun to learn. He didn't make it out. But hours later, the Arasketh screens blinked to life. Broadcast. Unauthorized. Signal source. Internal. There was Moran, bruised, bound, but alive. And beside him stood Garen. His voice was cold steel wrapped in silence. This is not a negotiation. This is not peace. He placed a hand on Moran's shoulder. This man came alone. So we gave him something in return. Moran lifted his head and stared directly into the lens. They're not just surviving. They're not hiding. They're building. They don't train machines to follow. They train children to lead. You still have a choice. He paused. Get off this planet before they let more of you live. The broadcast cut. And for the first time in his long career, Commander Vel didn't feel superior. He felt like a ghost staring down into a furnace that remembered how he burned. The transmission from Moran hung in the air long after the screen went dark. No one on the Arasketh moved. No one breathed. Vel remained frozen at the edge of the command deck, one hand gripping the railing so tightly the bone beneath his skin ached. His mind was a war of equations unraveling, certainties falling apart one variable at a time. They hadn't captured Moran. They'd used him. They let him speak, let him broadcast, let him deliver a message wearing the face of survival. That wasn't mercy. That was strategy. K-17 broke the silence with a flat tone. High Command has responded. Full-scale extermination order denied. Additional observation recommended. Vel didn't speak. He didn't need to. Everyone on the bridge saw it. Behind his silence, something cracked. Bureaucracy had killed His command. Now it would kill them all. He issued his next order without raising his voice. Prepare a kill team. No sensors. No AI guidance. Pure muscle and metal. Let's see if ghosts bleed. 12 soldiers. Fully armed. Rail rifles. Grenades. Flamethrowers. Their armor painted black, their visors polarized to avoid manipulation. Moran was still in the medbay, hooked to 4 drips and old guilt. But when Vel passed his stretcher, Moran turned his head. "They'll let you in," he said. "That's the first part of the test." Vel didn't look at him. "We're not here to pass their test." Moran chuckled softly. "Then you're already losing." The strike team dropped into the upper canyons, descending through a jagged fissure in the mountainside. The path was newly revealed, carved by a rock slide or more likely revealed by the colonists. It was too clean, too direct. The perfect route for overconfident boots and heavy armor. They moved in formation. No chatter, no light. But as they moved deeper, the silence changed. It wasn't empty, it watched. They passed abandoned classrooms filled with chalk dust and bones. Child-sized chairs arranged in perfect circles. Equations drawn in blood. Every corner told a story of learning and loss, fused into one. Then came the ambush. But it wasn't an ambush. It was a mechanism. The floor didn't give way, it opened. With cold precision. Not a booby trap, but a design. 3 soldiers fell before they could scream. One bounced off the steel, shattered legs screaming against armor. The other 2 were simply gone. Then the walls moved, not figuratively, literally. Panels rippled, as if the colony was breathing. Organic metal flexed with machine rhythm. Then came the sound, boots, but heavier. Synchronized. The ascendants arrived. They didn't attack like wild things. They flanked, mirrored, predicted. Each wore armor embedded in flesh, no weak points. Their eyes glowed with scanning light. Their mouths didn't shout, they studied. One soldier fired a rail shot point blank into an ascendant's chest. It staggered, looked down, touched the hole, and smiled like it enjoyed the sensation. Screams erupted through the team's comms, cut short by wet cracks and steel scraping bone. Vel watched from the Arasketh in real time. The feed glitched, red warnings flickering across screens as one by one soldier icons blinked out. "Fall back," Vel ordered, his voice colder than vacuum. "Get out of there." Only 4 made it back. One was missing half a leg. Another was in shock, blood crusted over her eyes. The third was hyperventilating, chanting a word that made no sense to the crew. They smiled. They smiled. Moran limped into the room. He didn't ask what happened. He saw it on the survivors' faces. "You sent wolves into a forge," he said. "Now they know you're sent." Vel clenched his jaw. "I've tactics." "That's what they're using." "Like insects." "No," Moran replied. "Like wolves, but smarter. They don't follow a queen. They follow a belief." Down below, in the forge chambers of the colony, Garen stood before a rusted steel altar. The ascendant who had taken a rail to the chest now knelt beside him, chest plate still scorched, skin already sealing. "They flinch at pain," he said. "They still believe pain means weakness." Garen placed a hand on his shoulder. "They haven't been taught like we have." He turned to Malric, who stood nearby, now taller, broader, his armor hand-forged and etched with symbols of the fallen. Garen looked up at the ceiling, toward the stars. "It's time." Malric nodded. "We strike?" "No," Garen said. "We teach." And far above, Vel made his final decision. "Power up the orbital cannon." K-17 hesitated. "That action violates 4 intergalactic treaties. I don't care." He locked targeting coordinates onto the colony's heart. "End it." Just as the cannon hummed to life, the ship jolted. A javelin of steel primitive, monstrous head launched from the surface. It ripped through the lower deck like a blade, disabling one engine and flooding the interior with fire. Impact, K-17 reported. Accuracy, unprecedented. Vel turned toward the display. The satellite feed showed something newly etched into the sand near the launch tower, the Jarthreith war symbol inverted. Beneath it, in broken Terran English, "Now we test you." Vel whispered the only truth left. They were never defending. They were preparing. He didn't say the next part. He didn't have to. They're 5 steps ahead, and we walked into the first one. The smoke that bled through the Arasketh's ruptured decks no longer smelled like fire. It smelled like failure. Acrid, bitter, and undeniable. Systems flickered between red and black, a stutter in the lights that mirrored the hearts of the crew uneasy, unmoored. Vel stood in the observation bay, watching the jagged scar in the hull where a javelin of scrap metal and fury had ripped through reinforced alloy as if the ship were made of paper. It wasn't just the strike that haunted him. It was the aim. Jarthreith engineering prided itself on precision. Their long-range weapons were calibrated to microfluctuations. But this was launched from the surface of a third-rate colony, built from scavenged wreckage and salvaged gravity cores, and it had landed within 7 meters of the ship's primary reactor shaft. Primitive? Vel muttered to himself. No, not even close. K-17's voice returned, hollow, subdued. Colony energy output has increased. Multiple relay jammers deployed across their perimeter. We have lost 62% satellite clarity. Visual on colony surface is minimal. Why jam us now? Vel asked. K-17 paused. Unknown. But Vel knew they were going dark for war. Down below, beneath a sky turning copper with atmospheric shift, Garen stood in the observation chamber built from the bones of old Terran dropships. The walls were etched in memory, names of the dead, messages to the unborn, and blueprints of every enemy vessel they'd ever encountered. He traced one line with his finger, a mark that represented the Arasketh. Malric approached from behind, his armor now heavier, his voice deeper. They'll retreat. No, Garen replied. They'll double down. Cowards retreat. Arrogance reloads. Beside him, 5 others stood silently, the core. None had rank. None wore insignias. Each had bled through fire. Each had buried a son or brother or student beneath this dirt. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Pain had made them fluent in silence. The ship is crippled, said Garrick, the oldest. We could send another wave. We will, Garen said, but not to finish them. He turned to the youngest among them, a boy of 15, sharp-eyed, lips sewn tight with discipline. You go up, not to kill, not to destroy. You watch. Learn how they react. Learn what they feel when they lose control. The boy nodded once, then disappeared into the corridor without another word. Above, in the Arasketh's medbay, Moran sat upright, one arm wrapped in synthetic grafts, the other holding a shard of steel etched with crude handwriting. We train with fire. We lead with. Lost. He stared at it for a long time. Not because it frightened him, but because he understood it. These weren't just fighters. They weren't terrorists or rebels or any of the tidy categories the Collective liked to use to simplify the unknown. They were disciples of memory. Vel entered. The 2 men stared at each other for a long moment. No salute, no pretense. We lost 9, Vel said. 2 self-terminated rather than risk capture. Moran didn't flinch. They knew the cost. I need a path in, Vel said. You won't find one from up here, Moran replied, slowly placing the steel shard onto the table. You'll have to bleed for it. Vel stared at him. You volunteering? Moran's lips curled into a smile, a bitter broken one, already packed. That night, a pod descended silent, masked under falling orbital debris. It slipped through the cracks of the colony's outer perimeter like water, graceful and forgotten. It landed softly in the ravine, camouflaged beneath heat-bent rocks and old burn craters. But it was already marked. Along the cliffs, embedded in the rocks like ghosts, children watched. Not with drones, not with scanners, but with lenses. They had carved themselves, adjusted for thermal flickers, layered with alien dust to avoid detection. They watched. Then pulsed the signal. The core knew, Moran didn't. He moved fast, clean, trained, every step calculated, every noise analyzed. He bypassed visible paths, cut through dead zones, stepped over pressure traps. He reached an unmarked entrance carved behind a false heat vent, and still it was too easy. He stepped into darkness, not the darkness of neglect, the darkness of intention. The chamber smelled like sweat and rust. 100 whispered voices rippled from beyond the steel grates. Moran crept toward the sound, boots silent, breath held. Then he saw it, a room filled with children, rows of them, standing, unmoving, repeating phrases like mantras. Enemy pressure. Suits fail at 7.4 atmospheres. Jarth sensory AI follows pattern recursion every 11 seconds. Strike where the joints weld. It wasn't a class. It was doctrine. They weren't reciting history. They were programming identity. One boy looked up slowly. His eyes met Moran's. There was no fear, no surprise, just acknowledgement. He raised one finger. Pointed. The alarm screamed, not like a siren, like a wail. A cry that rose from steel itself. The walls pulsed red. The floor shifted. The colony was alive, and it had just recognized its prey. Moran ran. He knew what came next. The ascendants. They didn't sprint. They didn't rage. They moved like machines, beautiful, terrible, symmetrical. One passed within inches of him without seeing him until it stopped, inhaled and smiled. Then the hunt began. On the Arasketh, Vel's monitors flared. Intruder detected. Quadrant Delta 5. He leaned forward. Moran. The signal glitched. Static surged. Then a voice. Moran's cut through the chaos. They've built a goddamn army. Then silence. The screen went black. 2 hours later, it came back on, not through the ship's systems, but from within. Broadcast intercepted. Moran sat bound in a chair, bruised, bleeding, but alive. Garen stood beside him. This is not a call for mercy, Garen said. He looked down at Moran, then back into the lens. This man came alone. He walked through the dark with eyes open. So we gave him what the galaxy never gave us. He stepped aside. Moran lifted his head. His voice was cracked, but steady. They're more than soldiers. They're believers. They've turned pain into structure. They've turned memory into religion. He looked into the lens. Into Vel's eyes. Get off this planet before they decide you're worth the trouble. Then the screen faded. Vel stood silent. For once no order followed, because deep down, he knew. They weren't just facing an enemy. They were facing the future. The air aboard the Arasketh was no longer breathable in spirit, even if the oxygen levels remained optimal. Commander Vel stood still as the ship's ventilation systems hissed softly, masking the tension that coiled through the halls like a waiting predator. The crew had stopped looking him in the eye. Not out of fear, but out of doubt. The kind of doubt that doesn't come from losing a battle, but from realizing they were never the superior force to begin with. In the corner of the command deck, the playback of Moran's transmission looped in a ghostly flicker. They've turned pain into structure, memory into religion. The message had spread despite attempts to contain it. Word was leaking. Not through official channels, but through whispers, unencrypted pulses, and cracked broadcast logs. Other Jarthreith ships had begun receiving fragments. Some officers dismissed it. Others filed quiet reports no one wanted to read. But Vel had read them all, and he knew what they meant. The colony wasn't an isolated infection. It was ideological contamination, and it was spreading. "Prep a full withdrawal," he ordered. The bridge crew hesitated. "Sir?" one asked. Vel's tone dropped to steel. "We're not equipped to understand what we found here, and High Command won't act until we've already lost. So we leave now." But it was already too late. From the vent shafts near the ship's stern, 6 human figures emerged, not ascendants this time, but ordinary colonists. Men and women, some old, some young, all focused, all armed, not with pulse rifles or advanced weapons, but with intent. They moved through the Araskith like they had rehearsed it 1,000 times, because they had. They had mapped every corner during the previous engagements, memorized patrol patterns, learned the crew schedules, and now they were executing a plan so simple, so analog, that the AI couldn't detect it until it was too late. By the time the main power grid flickered, the engine room was already lost. By the time internal sensors noticed the breach, the colonists had disabled the navigation core. No blood, no carnage, just surgical control. They weren't trying to destroy the ship. They were stealing it. Vel drew his sidearm and stood at the center of the command deck when the door finally opened. Smoke drifted in. Then Garen stepped through, unhurried, his armor battered but solid. Behind him walked 2 colonists, one holding nothing but a data crystal, the other carrying a stripped Jarth officer's insignia as if it were a souvenir. Garen raised no weapon. "You can fire," he said calmly. "But if you do, I blow coolant valves on 6 decks." Vel aimed. His hand trembled. Garen stepped forward and placed his forehead against the barrel. "You know what makes us different, Commander?" He whispered. Vel said nothing. "We don't fear death. We only fear being forgotten." And with that, he took the weapon from Vel's hands. No resistance, no violence, just the quiet theft of certainty. Because the moment Vel let go, he wasn't a commander anymore. He was a relic. In the observation bay, the surviving Jarth officers were locked into containment units. Not tortured, not interrogated, just held gently. And when the colonists left, they left a message on the transparent glass, etched backwards so it could be read from inside. This was mercy. "We only take the ones worth learning from." Then they were gone back to the tunnels, back into the myth. The Araskith systems were wiped. Not by virus, but by human hands. Every weapon schematic, every surveillance report, gone. The colonists hadn't stolen resources. They'd stolen knowledge. 6 hours later, Jarthreith. Reinforcements arrived. Too late. The Araskith had been gutted. The footage leaked somehow. A mix of Morin's message, the boarding, and a lingering shot of the symbol the colony had burned into the observation glass. AHANDPRINT. And below it, "You feared our weakness, but we weaponized it." The tribunal stripped Vel of command. He stood trial on 3 charges: negligence, unauthorized escalation, and exposure of military intelligence. But as the prosecutor spoke, he said nothing, because in his mind, he wasn't in that courtroom. He was still in the observation bay, still, watching Garen speak with no hatred, no rage, only memory. Back in the colony, Garen stood before a wall of names. Not of the dead, of the converted, Jarthreith defectors, alien smugglers, former Terran Marines who had believed the message when no one else did. Malric approached, now wearing a scarred plate of black alloy across his chest, the split earth. Flag, marked with the colony's inverted symbol. "They'll come harder next time," he said. Garen nodded. Then we believed them better. The forge behind them roared with new life. Children swung hammers in sync, not because they were being watched, but because it was their birthright to build weapons from ruin. Elsewhere, in a distant Jarth-controlled research moon, an alien named Daskel watched the footage again. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't political. He was a xenopsychologist, and he was terrified, not because of the violence, but because of the calm. That child who stood in the Arasketh command deck, holding the ship's fate in his hands, he didn't scream. He didn't gloat. He simply said, "This ship is now remembered." And somehow, that was worse than any war cry. Daskel didn't file a report. He simply whispered to himself, "If they have more colonies like this, then the galaxy doesn't belong to the living anymore. It belongs to the survivors." Earth's skies hadn't changed, but the silence beneath them had. High above the Pacific, a vessel hung in low orbit, not cloaked, not hidden, not armed in the traditional sense. It was built like a scar, jagged, blackened, welded from the skeletons of shattered Jarth dreadnoughts and Earth's forgotten expansion relics. No registry, no IFF beacon, no insignia. But etched into its hull, large enough to be seen from orbit, was the HANDPRINT black, open, defiant, and above it, a single phrase carved in blade-deep grooves. "We did not come to be heard. We came so you would remember." Inside the vessel, Garen stood alone on the forward deck, eyes locked on the blue and brown curve of the world he had once been born of, then discarded by. The others waited in silence behind him. Malric, the now battle-worn boy who had become a symbol of inherited fury. Moran, no longer Jarth, no longer Earth, but remembered. And 5 children dressed in the same cold-forged armor their parents had once bled in. Malric stepped forward, his voice like iron cracking. "They're watching us. Global sensors have locked in. Earth's entire defense grid has us surrounded." Garen didn't blink. "Good, let them see." He turned away from the view and faced the others. "Prepare for surface descent." "No weapons?" one asked. "No," Garen said. "We bring no fire. Not this time." He reached out and gripped Malric's shoulder. "We bring what burns, without flame." On Earth, in the Terran Senate building buried beneath layers of polished diplomacy and long-forgotten crimes, alarms had gone quiet. Military generals stood frozen before holoscreens. Dozens of diplomats stared as the black vessel began to descend. "They're landing." "Off the California coast," a junior aide whispered. The president of the Terran Union, an aging man who'd inherited too many sins and denied them all, watched the screen like it was a prophecy unfolding. What did they want? No one had an answer, because the ship didn't fire. It didn't broadcast. It simply touched down. A ramp unfolded. 7 humans stepped onto Terran soil for the first time in nearly a century. They wore no insignia. They carried no flags, just armor forged in fire, names of the dead carved into their shoulders, and the weight of a history too painful to speak. Garen walked barefoot as if to remind the world, this is not your land anymore. Around them, Earth's military waited on. Distant ridges. Defense mechs were powered up. Sniper drones tracked every movement. But no orders were given. Because something about these figures, these ghosts in blackened, still commanded a silence no protocol could break. Inside the Terran Senate chamber, Garen stood alone before the council. He had brought no speech. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at each of them with eyes that held no forgiveness. One of the counselors, trembling, tried diplomacy. "We acknowledge the loss. We acknowledge the pain. The expansion collapse, it wasn't planned. It was logistical. We couldn't maintain every colony. Garen tilted his head. You didn't lose control, he said. You let go. You deemed us expendable. Not worth the fuel to save. Another senator tried to recover. But you're here now. We want to help. We can offer aid. Infrastructure. Compensation. Garen's voice cut across the room like a blade. We do not want reparations. You cannot repair what you chose to forget. He took one step forward, no aggression. Just presence. We are not here to be reintegrated. We are not here to share what we've become. We're here to show you what your silence built. From his belt, he pulled a small data drive. He placed it on the floor before the podium. This contains a list of every name burned into our colony's walls, every child born after you abandoned us, every dead who never knew Earth, every victory you missed while pretending we no longer existed. He looked around the room one. Last time, we are not asking for anything. We are remembering. And now, so will you. He turned and walked out. No guards stopped him. No one moved. The next day, a capsule descended onto Earth's largest memorial site, a park filled with statues of long-lost colonies. It landed gently. Not with fire, but with grace. Inside was a pair of boots, child-sized, caked in ash and dried blood. Beside them, a plaque made of Jarth steel, melted down and engraved by hand. It read, "This is what you walked away from." What followed wasn't a war. It was a shattering. Across Earth, people stopped calling the colony rogue. They began calling it what it truly was, a mirror. In alleyways and factories, workers painted the black handprint on walls. In military academies, cadets watched footage of Garen and whispered the phrase, "We are not lost. We were left." And, worst of all for Earth and the Jarth alike, were the defections. Entire Terran ships broke rank. Old soldiers, veterans of the expansion, walked away from their posts and into the dark because they understood, because they agreed. Back in the colony, a new forge was lit. The core gathered. Garen stood above the flames, watching new weapons being shaped, not for conquest, but for memory. Malrich stood beside him. Earth didn't fire. They will, Garen said, eventually. Once they realize we didn't come to burn them. Malrich frowned. Then why did we come? Garen's eyes burned softly, to show them that their ghosts still walk. He looked at the galactic map pinned to the wall. More colonies had awakened. Not all human, some hybrid, some alien, but all bound by the same message. The same belief. That silence is not peace, that abandonment is not forgiveness, that memory is the sharpest blade in the void. A final message was sent from the colony, relayed across systems on a frequency no military protocol could jam. It was short. Simple. And burned its way into history like fire across paper. We were never gone. You just stopped looking. Now, we return not for home, but so the stars remember. What happens when you leave us in the dark? The signal echoed. Earth would never be the same. And somewhere, deep in a forgotten sector, another handprint was etched into steel. Waiting. Watching. Remembering.